Okay, let's continue to our discussion of alienation. In Marx, again, we said it's a Hegelian notion, but Marx uses it in a different way than that of Hegel's. And this particular work, 1844 Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, was never published in Marx's lifetime. It was published in 1930s, interestingly, by some Soviet institute of Marx and Engels, I guess, something like that, in the 1930s. So since the death of Marx, it was like 1875, I guess. I'm not sure. I always keep forgetting it. Must be have some fraudulent reason for this, right? He was born in 1888. Okay, let me check Marx life and work. Hopeless. Okay, you can find it. Anyway, in Marx's own lifetime, these particular manuscripts were not known. No, of course, it was known by Marx and Engels, etc. But then, after the death of Marx, it was forgotten, it seems, and it wasn't published, or at least until the 1930s, 1935, or something like that. So, a whole generation of Marxists since the end of the 19th century and until 1930s were not aware of the existence of these manuscripts. This is important because, in Das Kapital, as I said before, Marx never uses this framework, never mentions the notion of alienation and so forth. Instead, here his own choice is the notion of fetishism. At the end of the first chapter of Das Kapital, he talks about the fetishism of commodities. And this is particularly puzzling because, it may mean that Marx later abandoned his views about alienation, or he come to reject the Hegelian roots of the notion, maybe. I don't know. Althusser, French Marxists, Louis, I guess. Althusser argues that in Marx, we can see two different periods. One is the period of young Marx, between 1844, 1840s. And after 1850s, especially, the turning point was the publication of German Ideology with Engels in 1853, I guess. So there was a break in Marx's own thinking. After Lacan, he uses this term has come to be known as epistemic break. And this break refers that in the early Marx, when Marx was young, philosophy is much more important. Humanistic philosophy is much more important for Marx, ethics, realization of man, human potentials, etc., etc. But after 1850s, Marx, with Engels, of course, discovered a science of political economy. In the political economy science, there should be no place for value judgments or normative ideals, ethical considerations. So Marx's work is to be seen as a scientific work after 1850s. And this most important example, of course, is Das Kapital itself. It was planned as like 6 volumes, but Marx only wrote 3 of them. Actually, only the first volume was polished by Marx and published by himself. The remaining two volumes, volume 2 and volume 3, were published, edited and published by Engels. So some people, some Marxists, Marxologists, maybe, argue that Engels's intervention into Capital created some difficulties in understanding, or also in accepting some Marxian ideas, etc. That's another thing. That does not concern us right now. But this particular difference between young Marx and the old Marx may be seen really as a kind of the break that exists within Marx's own life, intellectual life, of course, we are talking about here. So if you are to understand Marx, we should look at his mature, so to speak, period. Period started with the German ideology and 1859, I guess, contribution to the critique of political economy, and finally Das Kapital, published in 1867, I guess. So basically, starting with the 50s, Marx had undergone an important transformation in his views. Some people say, like Althusser, but other people reject this idea because they argue that the roots, the philosophical roots of what Marx had written in his later phases of his life, in the earlier work, especially the philosophy or metaphysics, so to speak, developed in his earlier work, especially 1844 manuscripts and also some other writings, such as On the Jewish Question, the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right or philosophy of law, depending on the translation, etc. So basically, without having a clear understanding of this earlier work, one cannot make intelligible what Marx says in his later works, such as Das Kapital, etc. So, true, Marx does not mention alienation and this philosophical outlook in Das Kapital, but he also argues in the beginning of the Capital, in the preface, so to speak, of Capital, that Hegel was very important for him, and he never rejects his philosophy and so forth. He implies, or that what he had written is to be seen as improvements of Hegel's and application of his philosophy even to the capitalist reality, etc. I personally believe that there's a link or continuity between young and the old Marx, because I too believe that without understanding young Marx, you can never understand the old Marx. Anyway, in an article I have written in 2008, I argued that in order for the labor theory of value, for example, to be understood properly, we must go back to 1844 manuscripts, because these manuscripts draw a general philosophical framework or metaphysics in which we could understand the notion of labor power, and their importance in Marx's own thought. So it's on the reading list. It was published in Review of Radical Political Economics journal. You can reach it, I guess. So it's up to you to choose between these two views. But in my own interpretation, at least, no some drastic or radical rupture or break between the early Marx and the mature Marx. So to speak, from the very beginning, I would say, Marx was concerned with the notion of human freedom and the relationship between freedom and necessity, as I mentioned before. And even in Das Kapital and his later work, you can find this problematic as the basic one to determine the general intellectual framework that Marx uses. In capitalism, philosophically speaking, on the basis of these manuscripts, we can say that human beings are born free and they are to realize their own potentialities through the labor process or practice that takes place in a social setting through interactions with nature, etc. So human beings try to realize their own essences in the production process, but in this process, they also come to be alienated from their own essences, from the society, from their own species, etc. So it will create some problems. It will prevent individuals or human beings in general from being free. That's why we need socialism and eventually communism, according to Marx, to become free in the full sense of the term, in the sense of the realization of human potentials, etc., etc. Anyway, so this philosophical outlook of the 1844 manuscripts is important for Marx's whole enterprise, so to speak. Okay. So an important idea, again, associated with the Hegelian thought. Okay, he was born in 1818 and died in 1883. Of course, 1883, the year that Schumpeter and Keynes were born. Also, he died at the time. Anyway, okay, so he died in 1883. So anyway, okay, so the whole Marxian generation, as I said, was not aware of the existence of manuscripts. But interestingly enough, George Lukács, whatever, published a book in 1920s, 1925 or something like that, in which he explains actually, from a philosophical standpoint, the importance of Hegel for Marx, and he uses specifically the notion of alienation that is important in Marx. So this notion of alienation was used in Marx in the manuscripts, which was not known at that time by Lukács himself and other Marxists. So Lukács is known as the founder, one of the two founders, together with Karl Korsch, of the tradition that is known as Western Marxism, which places greater emphasis on the notion of freedom and humanistic elements in Marxist thought, ethics in general. So Lukács uses the notion of alienation, but he was not, of course, aware of the existence of the other term, objectification, in Marx. So he was not aware of this. He never distinguishes, in other words, between alienation and objectification. So it makes some confusion, to say the very least, about Marx's own views. But other than that, it's a very interesting and important book in the Marxist tradition. And I would also recommend you to read it, basically. Anyway, so Lukács argues, for example, that it is the dialectics as the basic method that Marx uses, which is the most important one in order to understand the whole Marxist or Marx's whole enterprise work. So even if he says something like this, even if whole ideas and predictions were to be rejected or falsified by the empirical evidence, this method of dialectics remains to be true and the only method that could be used in understanding society, in understanding human beings, in understanding capitalism. Again, this dialectics is based upon the notion of contradictions. Again, once again, Hegelian notion. Hegel argues that the being, the world of being, is constituted by or governed by the principle of becoming. Everything changes, including the spirit itself. The spirit transforms itself in its journey, so to speak, for its own realization, achieving its own self-consciousness. So in the beginning, he is a form of consciousness, but he was not, I'm not saying he, I shouldn't be saying he. It was not aware of itself, and it comes to be alienated from itself, becomes the material reality, and out of this material reality, human beings emerge, and through human thinking and reasoning, Hegel argues that the spirit thinks about itself and come to achieve its own self-consciousness. That's the end of history, as I said before. So this notion of becoming depends on, or actually characterizes, a dialectical process. Dialectics is an old philosophical term. In the beginning, it was used in different ways by different philosophers. For example, Kant rejects simply the notion of, or the method of dialectics. He says, it doesn't make much sense because it creates some violation of the principle of non-violation and non-contradiction, excluding the middle. But in the ancient Greek philosophy, it simply refers to a kind of argument, between the opposites. I have a view, you have another view, so we come to dialogue, we come to enter into a dialogue, so this is a dialectic process, etc. But Hegel uses the term in a very radical way. By the way, if you want to read an important Turkish text about dialectics, I would recommend you to read an important Turkish philosopher, Ioanna Kuchuradi, who was the founder of the Department of Philosophy at Hacettepe University, actually. She's a very important philosopher in Turkey and also in the world. And she has this beautiful text explaining the use of dialectics in the history of philosophy. And she also has very interesting things to say about Marxian dialectics. I didn't put it on the reading list, but I think you can find the particular piece in the collection of her writings entitled as Çağın Olayları Arasında. And I guess it was the book. Okay. Yes, it's Çağın Olayları Arasında. Among the events of the age, if you will. So this is a very interesting piece about Marx, not about Marx, I'm sorry, about the notion of dialectics. But dialectics is based upon the notion of contradiction. Contradiction in the sense of the violation of the Am I being shared this? No, I'm sorry. Okay. In the sense of the violation of this third principle of the laws of logic. According to Aristotle, these are the laws of logic. First is the rule of identity. Anything is identical to itself. Any being, any sentence, any proposition, any thought, whatever. And something is different from none itself. And it should be the case that either A or non-A, not both. So this third principle is known as the excluding the middle. There should be no middle in between A and non-A. But according to the notion of contradiction, both A and non-A is possible in Hegel. Hegel uses in a very ingenious way, I would say, and very hard to understand at the same time. You should read Hegel, but there's no guarantee that you would understand it. Maybe you can understand, you are smarter than me, so it's possible. So anyway, this particular idea shows that change, the notion of becoming, arises from contradictions in general. This spirit was in the beginning. It's a process, the philosophy of process of the spirit to achieve self-consciousness, basically. In the beginning, there was the spirit who does not know anything about itself. So it's a form of consciousness. It's a form of thinking, maybe, not necessarily human thinking. Some people argue that this is actually like Feuerbach, for example. This is actually Christian God, but Hegel does not say so. So it's the ultimate substance that the whole reality is constituted by, basically. So he's an idealist philosopher. It's a form of idea, a consciousness. But unfortunately, in the beginning, it is not aware of itself. So this is the first stage. Sometimes it's called thesis. And as an antithesis, opposing to this, as the negation of this beginning, there emerges material reality. In other words, the spirit itself is transforms itself, or without knowing, of course, into the material world. This is antithesis, and out of this material world, human beings emerge and they think, and through thinking, through human thought and human reasoning, the spirit comes to realize itself and achieve self-consciousness. This is the synthesis, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This is a very simple and crude, actually, expression of the process of dialectics, thesis, synthesis, and whatever, that thing. And unfortunately, even in the Marxian thinking, this particular crude approximation is used in an extensive way. And also after Engels, especially in his book, Dialectics of Nature, the three laws of dialectics were identified. One is the interpenetration of the opposites. Both A and non-A exist within the same entity. And another is negation of negation. The spirit negates itself when it becomes material reality. So in the end, the spirit again negates this material reality in the philosophical sense, of course, so that it achieves its own self-consciousness. So this is the negation of negation. And the third one is the transition from, I keep forgetting its particular name, transition from quantitative changes to qualitative changes. The most widely used example for this is the evaporation of waters. In the beginning, you use kettle to boil the water until boiling. When the water boiling, it becomes steam. Yes. So this is the transition from water to steam, etc. Something like this. The accumulation of small changes, so to speak, will bring about some big radical changes which cannot be reduced to the old stage of the process, so to speak. The notion of, for example, it's a distant example, but the notion of innovation can be seen in this way. Innovation refers to the position in which something quite new was created. And this new thing emerges from some small changes. Innovation refers to the case in which the very parameters or structural variables of the system are subject to change, and these changes will be brought about by small steps, small quantitative changes. The accumulation of quantitative changes will bring about some big qualitative changes. Some social unrest and class struggle will bring about the revolution, and revolution will create a new type of society, that is socialism, etc., etc. So that's the basic idea. The problem here is that, for example, one problem actually associated with dialectics is that there's a confusion as to whether dialectics is a method of thinking or method of reality itself. The material reality itself is said to be subject to dialectical changes, but some people argue that, like Coletti, for example, an Italian Marxist, Lucio Coletti, once he was Marxist at least, argued that there's no such thing as contradiction and dialectical changes in the reality itself, because it's the negation, it's a violation of the principle of non-contradiction. He's Aristotelian in that regard, so in order to do science, we should adhere to this principle, especially the principle of non-contradiction. But he later came to accept the view that, at least in the human sphere, there may be some contradictions in the sense of violations of the principle of excluding the middle. But he still insists that we should distinguish between real oppositions, a Kantian term, and the dialectical oppositions or contradictions, because real oppositions is a struggle or tension between two different, or maybe more than two different entities, such as the classes. Hegel says that, the spirit is the basic substance, but it comes to be alienated from itself, so it negates actually itself. But the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, for example, is not this type of relationship in which the opposition, the interpenetration of the opposition, the existence of A and non-A at the same time, because both proletariat and bourgeoisie are two different entities which cannot be reduced to each other, something like this. So an opposition is not simply a dialectical opposition, so we should be careful about this. And he completely rejects the existence of contradictions in the natural sphere. But, this is again an important point of debate within the Marxian circles. But these days, especially after the development of some natural sciences, such as the development of complexity, of the ideas of complexity and chaos theory, chaos and complexity theory, the existence of natural contradictions, so to speak, have come to be recognized by the scientists as well. So, I don't know. Some people argue that these developments in the natural sciences is a manifestation of the fact that nature is also subject to contradiction. So therefore, the process that Hegel describes is also a real process. Dialectics is a real process. In Hegel, there's no such distinction between methods and the reality itself, because he's consistent in this regard, because everything that occurs within the material reality is nothing but the transformations or constant changes through which the spirit undergoes. He says something like this: everything that is real is rational, and everything rational is also real. This is understandable because there's no difference in this philosophy between the method of thinking and the reality itself, because the reality itself is to be created and transformed by thinking. This is the essence of idealism, right? The reality itself is ideal, is a form of different manifestation, different appearance of the reality itself. So in Hegel, there's no such inconsistency between method of thinking and method of understanding the reality itself. So dialectics is to be explaining the moments that are occurring in the actual reality, and also in order to understand this reality, we should use dialectics, right? So in the Marxian circles, this dialectics is sometimes, this notion of this understanding of dialectics is adopted by different Marxists, such as Engels, for example, and the following people following Engels. And they argue that dialectic is both a method and also a principle that explains the reality, even if we are talking about here the material reality itself, because materialism simply rejects even the existence of idealism. Well, this is not true, particularly true for Marx or even for Engels, because they accept the existence of forms of consciousness and so forth, but they seem to be believing in the fact that, or the belief that, ideas or forms of consciousness depend on material reality, etc. So anyway, as regards to the method, even Marx himself distinguishes between the use of two different methods that are both dialectical. One is the method of presentation, according to him, and the other is the method of inquiry. For Marx himself says that, of course, the method of presentation is different from the method of inquiry. It's one thing to conduct your research and use the appropriate methods in that. It's quite another thing to present your findings, the results of this research. Sometimes, in other words, the two need not be the same or coincides with. Some people, for example, like Gareth Stedman Jones, argues that the method of dialectics is simply a method of presentation in Marx's own writings, and it's like an ornament. It's like a method of presenting the ideas in a colorful way, so to speak, in Marx's own writing, which does not necessarily mean that Marx believed in the principle of dialectics as can be applied to the reality itself. So he uses, according to Gareth Stedman Jones, Marx uses the method of dialectics as a method of presentation of his ideas. I don't know. Anyway, there are many interesting debates and controversies in this regard as well. So, you know, did I mention the fact that even Marx himself once said that he was no Marxist? So you can understand why. There are many problems and controversies within the Marxian thinking, and almost all of them actually emanates from Marx's own writings. You know, there's a saying that consistency is a sign of a small mind. Marx was a great mind, so for any great mind, it's quite normal to have some inconsistencies and contradictions. This may not be true for Hegel, by the way. You know, it's really hard to find inconsistencies in the sense in Hegel. It's a very completed and consistent systematic account in philosophy. That's very interesting. And Marx is sometimes said to have such a general systematic account, but Marx was not successful, at least in finishing his work. You know, he planned Capital, Das Kapital as being like 6 volumes, but only the first volume was written and also published by Marx himself. When you read Das Kapital, you can see it actually, because the first volume is very good in presentation and it's polished, so to speak. And the remaining 2 are sometimes not careful enough, sloppy, etc. But still they are important. You should read all 3 volumes and other works by Marx, of course, if you want to understand. Anyway, so dialectics could be a method explaining the reality itself, or it's simply a method of presentation, method of, you know, some kind of literary methods, even in order for us to, for the readers, to understand in a better way. Marx uses this dialectics, especially in his book, which was not published again, which was published after Marx's own death, Grundrisse. He uses this method in an interesting way. You know, there's a particular passage, for example, when he talks about the method of political economy, he says something like this. You know, production is a kind of consumption, but consumption is also a kind of production. You know, it's a kind of contradiction. And out of contradiction, there emerges the commodity, etc., etc. So basically, this is a dialectical fashion, so to speak. Again, in Marx, there are some colorful expressions or phrases. For example, in one place, he says that the expropriators are to be expropriated. This is a very powerful and colorful expression. You know, he says basically those who dominate and exploit the workers, the bourgeoisie, are to be dominated by proletariat, by the proletariat when revolution occurs, etc. Anyway, he mentions actually when he talks about the history of capitalism, strictly speaking, but the idea is clear enough. Anyway, this dialectics may refer to a method of presentation or method of reality, or it may or may not apply to the material reality as well. In Hegel, all of them are conflated to the one principle only. You know, the reality is what the spirit thinks, what the spirit thinks is the reality itself. So what is rational is real, and what is real is also rational. But in Marx, of course, he is not an idealist. What is real may not be rational. The capitalist reality is actually not rational in Marx because, you know, true, it's based upon some, it works upon some rational principles. such as the working of the market, the process of production, etc., etc. But in general, it's not rational in the sense that it's full of contradictions. And these contradictions will bring an end to the capitalist mode of production in the future, etc. So this idea of the working of capitalism as full of contradictions, tensions, and struggles is an important methodological principle in understanding capitalism, and a similar methodology is used by, interestingly, for example, Schumpeter himself as an important economist. Of course, Schumpeter is no Marxist, and he has some respect towards Marx, and he distinguishes between two Marxes, actually. One is what he calls prophet, and the other is the scientist. And scientist is very important for Schumpeter, and the prophet is not that important. Political views are simply rejected by Schumpeter. Schumpeter was an admirer of aristocracy. That's interesting. So he does not like actually the bourgeoisie or the Marxists in general, but interestingly enough, he was a minister in the socialist government in Vienna after the First World War. In the time of the Red Vienna, he was a minister for a brief time. So he also has full of contradictions. Again, greatness of mind requires some forms of inconsistency, maybe. Anyway, contradiction and inconsistency are not the same. Contradiction is inconsistent, but not every inconsistency can be seen as a kind of contradiction. So contradiction is the rejection, specifically, of the principle of non-contradiction, or the principle of excluding the middle, the existence of both A and non-A. This is called interpenetration of the opposites in the Marxian circles. Anyway, but even more important than the notion of contradiction, I believe, personally, in understanding dialectics, is the notion of totality. Totality means that there are very complex relations within the whole. If you want to understand the society, for example, we should look at its totality. It is formed by individuals and also relations among individuals. For example, Marx once said, in Capital, I guess, I don't remember exactly, but says something like this: political economy is about relations among individuals and relations among relations, social relations. What do I mean by this? Das Kapital, we are going to talk about this, of course. Das Kapital starts with the discussion of commodity, and he says basically, commodity is not simply a thing, a material thing, but actually it's a social relation. A social relation has two sides, right? The worker and the capitalist. And this social relation, within this social relation, the dependency of the worker to the capitalist is constantly reproduced. So it's a kind of a social relation in which labor is alienated from its own product. So in other words, labor power becomes a commodity. Becomes a commodity. It is true for both ordinary commodities, goods and services, whatever, and also about labor power itself. Labor power becomes a commodity, so it's a social relation. So is capital. Capital is a social relation as well. So if we look at the relationship between capital and commodity, it's a kind of relation between two relations. So this is the manifestation of the notion of totality. We should look at the totality of capitalism if you want to understand. Within this totality, there emerges contradictions, and the notion of emergence is important here. What is emergence? Emergence means that, again, in the Schumpeterian idea of innovation, we have this change, the abrupt and qualitative change that occurs within the system, and this system is something very new which cannot be understood on the basis of the previous changes or previous relations among different structural variables. So quite a new system even will emerge. So reality is to be seen, in a sense, multi-layered reality. You know, each layer is based upon a lower layer, and this upper layer will emerge from the lower layer, but the upper layer can never be reduced to the lower ones. So basically, this is the notion of emergence, and there are also contradictions within the totality itself. And it is the existence of these totalities that gives the character of the totality as different from other types of totalities, basically. So capitalism is a totality, it's a real totality. So if you want to understand the working of this totality, you should consider the complexities, the relations of emergence, and contradictions that exist within this totality. Society is also a totality, which means basically that it's a whole that cannot be reduced to its constituent parts. You know, the Aristotelian principle that the sum, the whole is greater than the sum of its particular parts. It's the relationship between part and the whole, parts and the whole. So the totality is something different from its parts. Individuals, the collection of individuals is not to be identified with society itself, because society as an ontological entity is different from the sum of or the collection of individuals. Think about this way. For example, in the welfare economics, you must remember, the Benthamite welfare function. Jeremy Bentham argues that the utility or the welfare of the society is equal to the sum of individual utilities. You know, my utility plus net utility we are talking about, the difference between pleasure and pain, remember? So my utility, your utility, others' utility, etc. If we add up these particular individual utilities, we come up with the magnitude of social utility, right? So, in other words, here, the relationship between the parts and the whole itself is a linear relationship. The sum of these parts will create the whole, but most of the time, in social sciences as well, especially, this is not the case. The relationship between parts, individual parts, and the totality itself, or the whole itself, is non-linear in the sense that there's a relationship of emergence, the fact of emergence. You know, if you collect individuals and add up something else, we can have society, but society cannot be created, cannot be reduced into the sum of its part. That's the notion of totality. So within the totality, it's very difficult to understand the totality by its very definition, because it's full of tensions, changes, the notion of becoming, interpenetration of the opposites, contradictions, etc., etc. So there's only one method to understand the working of this totality, according to Hegel and according to some Marxists, which is dialectics itself. Anyway, this is a very big debate, so to speak, but At least we can say that there are some contradictions within the human realm. There may or may not be contradictions in the natural reality. I'm not concerned with that, although I do not reject the possibility of the existence of contradictions in the natural realm as well, but there are some contradictions in the human realm. First, contradiction between individuality and society. Human beings are both individuals and social beings. Between freedom and necessity, we are free, but also not free in our actions. And between agency and structure, this is an important matter of controversy in the social sciences, methodology of social sciences in general. Agency means, the power of making a difference. Structures usually limit, constrain our actions. So this contradiction between the agency and structure is an important problematic of the social science in general. That includes Marx as well, and also, last but not least, contradiction between human essence and existence, which is alienation, and its culmination, commodity fetishism. So next week, we are going to talk about these contradictions in the human realm and their importance for understanding Marx. I am going to stop here, and we'll see each other next week, I hope.